May 1940, Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Hermann Göring flips through an American report and lets out a laugh. The document reported that President Roosevelt had asked Congress for authorization to build 50,000 airplanes a year. Göring looked at the generals and quipped, "Do they believe that propaganda wins wars?" To the Luftwaffe commander, the United States was a nation of distracted consumers, good at refrigerators, terrible at war. A fragile, racially impure society, without discipline, where women riveted metal, nothing that could threaten the Reich. That laughter was about to be silenced by a force Göring never understood, mass production, because what started as mockery turned into collapse. In just 4 years, the United States has not only reached the goal, it has doubled, and every plane that left Willow Run was more than steel. It was the response of an industrial democracy against an ideological tyranny. This video will reveal how the Third Reich, blinded by its own arrogance, underestimated American engineering, large-scale logistics, and the coordination of a free nation, and how this miscalculation turned a joke into a sentence. Because in the end, who had the last laugh? It was swallowed up by 100,000 planes. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. In 1944, as Germany mustered desperate efforts to maintain production in ruins, the United States manufactured 96,270 aircraft, nearly 10 times what it had produced at the start of the war, surpassing the entire annual Axis capacity alone. As the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its planes in the air, a single American factory promised and delivered a new bomber every 63 minutes. This is the contrast that feeds the heart of this narrative. The Reich bet on racial superiority, the Americans on statistical superiority. If you value history told with depth and little remembered facts, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps this channel to continue revealing the technical backstage that decided the fate of the century. Berlin, late May 1940. In the dark-walled office of the Air Ministry, Hermann Göring held in his hands a document from the United States. The report described Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress. The American president called for the nation to prepare to manufacture 50,000 planes a year. Göring smiled. It wasn't a smile of concern, it was a smile of disdain. "They don't know what they say," he said, according to witnesses. For the commander of the Luftwaffe, a country of mixed immigrants, led by undecided civilians, would never understand what real war was. Air production of this kind required more than assembly lines. It required discipline, hierarchy, pure blood, and in this, he believed, the Reich had no rivals. Göring turned to the officers and, in a tone of irony, mentioned the absurd idea of converting automobile factories into air production centers. "They think that building a fighter jet is like making refrigerators," he scoffed. The Nazi elite, steeped in concepts of racial purity and technical supremacy, saw American industry as a consumerist chaos, inefficient, noisy, dependent on women and minorities, populated by blue-collar workers with no military tradition. The prejudice was not accidental, it was part of the doctrine. The Nazi model of war was vertical, centralized, rigid. The American model, on the other hand, was decentralized, adaptive, based on collaboration between civilians, engineers, and the military. But in 1940, none of this seemed relevant. The Wehrmacht was marching through France. The Blitzkrieg impressed the world, and the United States, seen as a slow giant, seemed harmless. In private, Hitler called American society a mixed, degenerate race, incapable of prolonged effort. When asked about the enemy's industrial potential, he replied, "They have factories, but they don't have a soul." Göring followed this logic, convinced that the Luftwaffe's superiority was indisputable, technically, morally, and numerically. The American memo was filed, classified as propaganda. No one in the German High Command stopped to calculate what 50,000 planes a year would represent. No one questioned what would happen if the number was real, or worse, if it were overcome. That was the first blindness, and it would cost dearly. In 1939, Germany produced about 8,295 military aircraft. The United States only 3,611. The Reich believed that this initial advantage was permanent, but it ignored two critical factors: America's ability to expand and its culture of industrial adaptation. What the Germans called civil disorganization proved to be flexibility. What they called inferior labor proved to be an inexhaustible labor force. When they saw women riveting bomber structures, they ridiculed. When they discovered blacks in production line positions, they interpreted it as a sign of decadence. But while they ridiculed, the numbers grew. By 1942, American production already exceeded 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, it exceeded 85,000. And in 1944, it hit almost 100,000 planes, one every 5 minutes. German production at its peak barely reached 40,000 a year. American aircraft production was 2.5 times greater than Germany's at its best. If this data surprises you, comment below. Logistics wins. The irony of history is mathematical. Every Allied air attack was possible because someone in Detroit, Chicago, or Long Beach had pushed a button, assembled a piece, tuned an engine. Göring mocked civilians making airplanes, not realizing that it was these civilians who would soon dominate the skies. And the most serious, even when German reports began to indicate the increase in American production, the High Command ignored it. Friedrich von Boeticher, German military attaché in Washington between 1933 and 1941, sent several warnings about the American industrial escalation. In one of his memos, he wrote, "The mobilization they are initiating is of a scope we have never seen. Their capacity is not just potential, it's executable." His warnings were ignored. Göring considered Boeticher a pessimist. He preferred to trust in his own conviction that the American people would not endure a protracted war, that they would give up, which, in the end, were nothing more than a consumer economy. But the consumer economy has learned to make fighters, and he made thousands. This part of the story ends where German pride still seemed intact. But on the other side of the Atlantic, a factory had already been designed to produce the impossible. Willow Run, the largest assembly line in the world, was about to be born, and with it would come Göring's second miscalculation, even more lethal than the first. May 16, 1940. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt steps to the rostrum of Congress in the midst of a country still hesitant, divided, and scarred by the Great Depression. In the background, Europe was burning under the march of the Panzer divisions. France imploded. England was preparing to resist alone. But in the United States, the prevailing feeling was still one of isolation. Roosevelt, however, did not come to talk about neutrality. Faced with a nation that produced just over 3,600 aircraft a year, he firmly declared, "I wish to see this nation prepared to produce at least 50,000 airplanes annually." The reaction was immediate and skeptical. Economic experts called the plan unworkable. Conservative politicians considered him alarmist. Even allies questioned whether the figure was real or rhetorical. In 1940, the American Air Force barely existed. The Army Air Corps had just over 1,700 fighter planes, many of them obsolete. The infrastructure was precarious, training was limited, and the industrial apparatus was still focused on civilian production. But Roosevelt saw beyond the data. He didn't just see factories, he saw potential. He didn't just see tools, he saw purpose. His plan was not just to manufacture airplanes, it was to transform democracy into the power of production. Instead of forced mobilization, it would call on engineers, businessmen, and civilian workers. Instead of centralized command, it would create productive alliances between government and private initiative. What the Nazis called weakness, diversity, freedom, the market, Roosevelt saw as latent strength. It was a huge risk. The American economy had not yet fully recovered. Unemployment persisted. The unions were strong but suspicious of the government. The automobile industry was efficient, but it was not prepared to manufacture airplane engines, pressurized structures, or weapon systems. And most of all, the American people did not want to go to war. Still, Roosevelt launched the proposal, not as a war plan, but as a moral imperative. For him, producing airplanes wasn't just about arming oneself, it was about ensuring that freedom had the tools to survive. In practice, the discourse began a silent transformation. Instead of tanks in the streets, there would be projects on the drawing boards. Instead of inflammatory speeches, signed contracts. And slowly, the country would begin to move. The day after the speech, newspapers treated the proposal as audacious but unrealistic. In Germany, the intelligence services underestimated the impact. A report intercepted months later shows that the Luftwaffe regarded the ad as symbolic propaganda for domestic consumption. The Germans were too busy celebrating the imminent fall of France to worry about promises from a country that had not even declared war. But behind the scenes in the United States, Something was beginning to line up. Roosevelt called on industrial leaders, engineers, and civilian technicians. He began the creation of production councils, contract commissions, and factory conversion studies. The order was clear. Every civilian factory that could be adapted for military purposes would be mapped and enlisted. The goal was to turn the United States into what he would call, months later, the arsenal of democracy. The idea was not just to manufacture weapons, but to keep the economy alive, generate jobs, and regain the country's confidence through productive effort. While Germany used forced labor and slave labor to sustain its war machine, Roosevelt was betting on something radically opposite, voluntarily motivating millions of civilians to build the tools of freedom. The first steps were slow, but the concept, launched in that speech, would germinate with force in the following years. A sentence written by a journalist of the time summed up the proposal. America did not enlist in the war. It enlisted in production. The contrast between the Reich and the United States was beginning to emerge. On the one hand, a regime that believed in racial superiority, state centralism, and the imposition of order. On the other, a plural society where civilian factories would be commanded by ordinary men, where women would learn to rivet bomber structures, where newly arrived immigrants would operate lathes, presses, and conveyor belts. Roosevelt was issuing a challenge to the very concept of modern warfare, and the most ironic, he had not even declared war yet. The promise of 50,000 planes was not a military response, it was an industrial proposal. Germany did not understand. The Nazi elite, stuck in the traditional view of combat and doctrine, believed that the war was won with elite soldiers, fast tanks, and superior fighters. They did not understand that in the 20th century, winning would require continuous supply, perfect logistics chains, productive redundancy, and untapped human and technical reserves. Roosevelt's speech was the first spark, and when the first contracts were signed, the first warehouses converted, and the first civil engineers called to the task, the machine began to turn. It was still slow, but it was already moving. Germany did not notice. But one man in Detroit had already understood what lay ahead. He was not a general nor a politician. He was an engineer. And his name would appear discreetly behind the scenes of that transformation. William Knudsen, the man who agreed to work for $1 a year to lead the largest factory conversion operation in modern history. And it is with him that the next part begins. Because while Hermann Göring laughed at the American proposal, Knudsen was already drawing the lines that would produce one bomber per hour. In 1940, as German officers laughed at the idea of a war-producing America, a man in Detroit began to reorganize the impossible. William S. Knudsen, a Danish-born American, former chairman of General Motors, and one of the world's foremost experts on mass production, was personally called by Roosevelt. The proposal was symbolic and radical, to lead the American industrial mobilization for a salary of $1 a year. Knudsen accepted without hesitation. He was not in the military, did not make speeches, and did not like the spotlight, but he possessed a talent that the Reich would never consider a threat. He knew how to organize people, machines, and deadlines. Where others saw logistical limits, he saw production flows. Where others saw civilian factories, he saw arsenals on standby. In the months following his appointment, Knudsen toured the country. It brought together executives from Ford, Chrysler, Packard, Curtiss-Wright, Boeing. He visited power plants, railway depots, aluminum mines, and distribution centers. It mapped out what could be converted and what needed to be built from scratch. With simple language and technical precision, he convinced reluctant businessmen to manufacture pieces they had never seen before. His orders didn't come with threats. They came with charts, spreadsheets, and schedules. His authority came from knowledge and trust. Knudsen knew that to build 50,000 planes, it was necessary to redesign the backbone of the American economy. And he did this starting at the grassroots. Instead of centralizing everything in Washington, it decentralized. It created parallel supply chains, interconnected by trains, ships, and trucks. It established goals by regions. A state would manufacture engines, another, fuselages, a third, radios and instruments. The final assembly would take place where logistics allowed. The goal was to transform the production of war into a synchronized and self-sufficient choreography. A bomber like the B-17 needed more than 13,000 pieces. Knudsen established that none of them should depend on a single supplier. With this, it created redundancy. If one factory was hit, others would cover it. Germany has not understood this concept. Tied to a vertical production structure, the Germans centralized the assembly of airplanes in a few poles. This worked as long as the Reich dominated the skies, but when the bombings began, the vulnerability was exposed. Knudsen, on the other hand, was preparing American industry to function under attack, even before the war began. What's more, he did all this while the country was still at peace. The Luftwaffe called this an exaggeration, but by the end of 1941, without a single American soldier having yet set foot in Europe, the United States was already producing 2,000 planes a month. Most fighters and bombers were still sent to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. But what was impressive was the growth curve. The reports sent by Bötticher to German intelligence in 1941 revealed an increase in industrial production on a scale never seen before. The warning was again dismissed as scaremongering. Knudsen, in turn, did not stop. In partnership with Charles E. Wilson of General Motors and Charles Sorensen of Ford, he began adapting tools from automobiles to aircraft components. Returns were immediate. Packard began producing, under license, British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for the P-51 Mustangs. General Motors installed specific assembly lines for radial engines. Chrysler converted transmission factories to the production of aerial cannons. Within months, civil engineers were designing assembly lines for weapons, instruments, wiring, and hydraulics as efficiently as those who produced cars. Knudsen also insisted on the technical training of the new workforce. He knew that American industry would have to train millions of people who had never been in a factory before. Women, farmers, uneducated youth, immigrants. It created qualification centers, accelerated programs, and simplified manuals. Every person who entered the factories had to leave within weeks as a functional worker. The Germans did not understand the logic. They saw women in the factories and concluded that Americans were collapsing. They called desperation what was, in fact, strategy. The Luftwaffe did not understand that this system was more resilient than any militarized model. The Americans weren't just making weapons, they were building a social mobilization machine, and she was just getting started. In early 1942, Knudsen delivered to the government the first national plan for integrated air production, providing for more than 125,000 aircraft in 3 years. That same month, German production barely exceeded 7,000 planes per year. What the Nazis saw as propaganda became statistical reality. A civil engineer without a uniform had done what no German marshal predicted: transform an unarmed country into the greatest air power in history. But the real symbol of this plan was still on paper, an installation so colossal that the Americans themselves called it madness, a factory that would produce a heavy bomber every hour, and that soon would make Hermann Göring himself revise all the calculations he believed infallible. Because Willow Run wasn't just an industrial plant, it was a sentence of defeat, and its construction would begin in the next chapter of this story. Willow Run, Michigan. Built in record time on cornfields, the factory promised by Henry Ford and his engineers was a bold promise: to produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. On paper, it seemed genius. A continuous assembly line, inspired by the automobile model, but adapted to the complexity of war aviation. However, when the first bombers began to roll off the line in September 1942, reality exposed all the cracks in the plan. The first completed B-24 had to be almost entirely rebuilt. The systems did not align. The pieces didn't fit. The tolerances, which were acceptable in cars, proved fatal in airplanes. Engineers found that untrained riveters damaged fragile structures. Poorly installed wiring harnesses caused shorts. Cockpits came with uncalibrated instruments. Production was technically in operation, but what came off the line was unacceptable by Air Force standards. By February 1943, the plant was delivering only 56 bombers a month, less than a fifth of the target. Newspapers began calling the project "Will It Run?", a pun that mocked the factory's ability to even function. Congress questioned the investments, and the Luftwaffe laughed. Intercepted intelligence reports revealed that German officials considered Willow Run to be final proof of American technical inferiority. For them, the failure of the industrialized B-24 showed that making cars was not the same as making war machines. The Reich interpreted the mistakes as a sign of cultural collapse. And once again, he confused noise with bankruptcy. Because while the machines failed, Ford engineers did what they knew best: adapt. Charles Sorensen, who was in charge of production, ordered a complete re-engineering of the line, broke down the B-24 into smaller subsets. He created specific tools for each stage, installed trusses that carried complete sections along 1.5 kilometers of track. Riveting tools were redesigned for smaller hands, many operated by women. Electrical cables are now prefabricated in jigs, which has reduced errors. Test stations were installed prior to final assembly, eliminating accumulated failures. Willow Run has become a laboratory of trial and error, with virtually unlimited resources. And over time, the production line stopped being an experiment to become a system. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Americans were wrong, yes, but they made mistakes in public. They adjusted in real time. And where the Reich saw shame, American industry saw learning. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed behind-the-scenes content of this war decided by numbers. In September 1943, Willow Run reached production of 148 bombers monthly. In December, it reached 365. The pace was not yet as promised, but it already exceeded all of Germany's heavy bomber production in the same period. The final turning point came in April 1944. 428 B-24s delivered in a single month, one every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The factory that had been the butt of jokes became a nightmarish statistic, and the Luftwaffe, which had previously been disdainful, was beginning to feel the consequences of this persistence on the battlefield. The next chapter will show the moment when the skies of Tunisia revealed the real dimension of this change, and the day when even the aces of the Luftwaffe admitted that the enemy was now another. By mid-1943, what began as a logistical experiment had become an operational colossus. Willow Run, the factory that almost failed at birth, became the largest assembly line in the world under a single roof. At 3.5 million square feet, and with a continuous conveyor belt more than a mile long, the facility symbolized a historic break in the way military power was produced. Instead of artisan workshops with skilled workers, as was common in Germany, Willow Run standardized processes, fragmented tasks, and created stations that could be operated by any trained worker. The plant utilized hydraulic tools for precision riveting, pre-assembled wiring harnesses with quick-install labels, modular frames for fitting directly into the fuselage, and a network of overhead tracks to transport entire components between sections. Each new problem generated a new protocol. Each bottleneck was mapped and solved with data. Production of a B-24 Liberator, an aircraft with more than 1.2 million individual parts, has been reduced to a timed sequence of rational decisions. In September 1943, the factory reached the production of 365 bombers in the month, one per day. But that was just the beginning. The obsession with efficiency transformed Willow Run into a living, adaptable creature. In December, there were 365 planes. In April 1944, the goal that seemed utopian was reached. 428 B-24s produced, one every 63 minutes. The time between one rivet and another had become more lethal than any Luftwaffe squadron, and the skies of Europe would soon feel this impact. While American production flew by, Germany retreated to caves, literally. With major factories vulnerable to Allied bombing, the Reich began a dispersal program, moving assembly lines to abandoned mines, railway tunnels, and caves in the Alps. What was centralized became improvised, without adequate ventilation, without standardization, and with transport between units by vulnerable and scarce trains. The German system began to collapse from within. Parts were not enough. Planes left with defects, engines stopped in the middle of tests, and meanwhile the American production line operated in 3 continuous shifts under fluorescent light and precision stopwatches. The difference wasn't just technological, it was conceptual. The Reich built airplanes out of fear, the United States with freedom. This freedom allowed for what the Nazi generals never understood: productive decentralization and reliance on the worker. At Willow Run, the suggestions came from the factory floor. Workers proposed improvements. Women drew templates. Engineers incorporated these changes in real time. The flow of information was horizontal. The result was a plant that learned, corrected, evolved. In Germany, any design change went through months of hierarchical validation. In Willow Run, changes occurred in days. A displaced machine gun turret, an adjusted propeller, a new attachment point on the landing gear. Everything was tested and incorporated without interrupting production. The line never stopped. The irony was brutal. The regime that saw itself as superior in discipline and technique was now overtaken by a factory that listened to housewives, young immigrants, and former car mechanics. And each plane produced bore this invisible signature. Willow Run's B-24 wasn't just a machine, it was an aluminum answer to the doctrine of supremacy. At the same time, the industrial cost per unit was falling. Ford was able to produce heavy bombers at progressively lower prices, even with the addition of new systems. Standardization of parts reduced repair time in the field. The interchangeability of components facilitated supplies on the European and Pacific fronts. The Luftwaffe, which had previously relied on bespoke models such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, now faced an enemy that compensated for quality with volume and durability. On the field, the effect was visible. American squadrons were increasing. The losses were quickly replaced, and morale, sustained by an uninterrupted rearguard, remained high. Germany, on the other hand, faced an insoluble equation. Each pilot shot down cost months of training. Each plane lost was a hole in the front line. Each piece sabotaged by forced labor compromised combat. And in light of this, Willow Run continued to produce. Producing when it rained, when it snowed, when Berlin said that the Americans were close to exhaustion. Producing with workers who had never been on an airplane. The world's largest factory under a single roof had become the Luftwaffe's silent nightmare. Commander Adolf Galland, in an internal report to the German leadership, wrote in February 1944, "American air superiority is not based solely on aircraft numbers, but on continuous replacement. We attack today and tomorrow they come back with a triple." The Reich was finally beginning to understand, but understanding it was already too late. Because on the other side of the ocean, the fruits of Willow Run would take to the African skies. And in Tunisia, a Luftwaffe major, a veteran of dozens of missions, would see something he had hitherto thought impossible: bombers rising from the horizon to infinity. He couldn't believe his eyes, and his words, recorded in his flight log, would give voice to what many already felt. The enemy was now an industry. In 1940, while Roosevelt was addressing Congress on the other side of the Atlantic, Colonel Friedrich von Boertke, Germany's military attaché in Washington since 1933, was preparing an urgent report for the Nazi High Command. In it, he bluntly stated, "American industrial mobilization will reach unimaginable heights." His documents, sent between 1939 and 1941, were meticulously detailed, based on factory visits, conversations with engineers, and direct observation of the transformation that was underway. But in Berlin, his analysis fell into the void. For Hitler, Boertke was just another defeatist. At a meeting held in February 1939, the Führer mocked the warnings, stating that the United States was racially and culturally degenerated. Half Judaized, half blackened, incapable of sustaining a long-term war, he declared. The belief in the inferiority of the adversary was as ingrained as it was illusory. Göring, for his part, systematically ignored the bulletins. His doctrine relied on a short war, with lightning attacks and air superiority based on tactical maneuvers and experienced pilots. He did not understand, or did not want to understand, that total war would require something much more profound: production on a continental scale. The warnings continued. Boertke pointed to the growth of the aeronautical sector, the increase in the hiring of workers, and the accelerated conversion of civilian factories. Each month brought a new issue that called into question the vision of Berlin. Still, the Nazi leadership dismissed the projections as propaganda or exaggeration. For them, factories operated by women and blacks could not sustain reliable production. This ideological blindness has turned prejudice into strategic weakness. Instead of reacting accordingly, Germany maintained a restricted production pace, still based on semi-autarkic methods and with a heavy dependence on skilled labor, something increasingly scarce as the conflict intensified. The disparity began to reveal itself in the skies. During the Tunisian campaign in December 1942, Major Johannes Steinhoff, commander of the Luftwaffe's JG-77 group, recorded in a report, "American pilots are no longer amateurs. The most disturbing thing is that there are more of them every day." The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with a superior and well-trained fleet, began to deal with a new reality: unequal combat, rapid enemy replacement, and constant sorties. The mathematics of the war was beginning to turn against the Reich. Quantity has become as determining a factor as skill. Even German veterans began to realize the logistical chasm. Casualties in the ranks of experienced pilots could not be replaced at the same speed. By 1943, Germany was training new aviators with accelerated programs and reduced training. The United States, on the other hand, expanded its flight schools, trained thousands simultaneously, and supplied its squadrons with new planes every month. Numerical superiority was transformed into doctrine. During the so-called Big Week, between February 20 and 25, 1944, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces launched more than 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, but the most critical was the loss of nearly 100 veteran irreplaceable pilots. General Adolf Galland, head of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, wrote to Göring shortly after the operation, "We are losing 1,200 fighters a month and producing only 1,000. Americans are producing 2,500 a month and losing 400. It was the bitter acknowledgement of a truth that had been ignored for years. But even in the face of the evidence, Göring remained blind. In internal pronouncements, he still promised to restore air superiority with new weapons, such as the Me-262 jet fighter, and denied that the American advantage was sustainable. Internally, the rhetoric no longer convinced even the generals themselves. The Luftwaffe, once proud of its autonomy and technical capacity, now found itself subordinated to political decisions detached from the reality of the countryside. And this disconnection took a toll. German intelligence reports received in 1943 mentioned that American factories were operating in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. German analysts dismissed the documents, calling them Allied exaggerations. Once again, ideology prevented adaptation. They could not conceive that civilian women, housewives, secretaries, chambermaids were now producing bombers with accuracy higher than the average German factory. In Douglas Long Beach, 22,000 women riveted, tested and inspected parts with margins of error of less than 1%. In Willow Run, Rosa Munro placed 3,000 rivets per turn with a 99.5% accuracy rate. It was the antithesis of Nazi doctrine and the final blow to the Luftwaffe's pride. Germany, convinced that production was only possible with Aryan blood and militarized discipline, underestimated the power of democratic mobilization. He didn't understand that the American workforce was driven by purpose, not obedience. Each rivet was not an order. It was a voluntary act, a vote of confidence in victory. Betischer's reports were right from the start, but no one listened to them. And when reality finally set in, it was too late to adjust course. In October 1943, after yet another devastating air offensive, Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, wrote, "Today, the skies were covered with bombers, hundreds. They came from all directions. There were 8 of us. It was the harbinger of what was to come, a war no longer of skill, but of endurance. And in the next part, we'll look at what happens when every American bomber flying above Germany carries not just bombs, but a statistic that the Nazis refused to see. In the depths of the American war effort, there was an invisible but fundamental cog, the workforce that had never set foot on a battlefield, but had redefined the very concept of war. Unlike the Nazi doctrine, which saw power as something concentrated, racialized, and hierarchical, American democracy leveraged its diversity as a productive force. In 1941, less than 1% of workers in the aircraft industry were women. In 1943, they already represented 65%. They were mothers, wives, daughters, and widows, operating hydraulic presses, riveting wings, welding fuselages. Rosa Munro, Willow Run's original riveting machine, placed 3,000 rivets per shift with 99.5% accuracy. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe intelligence interpreted the data with disbelief. A report captured in 1943 stated that the increase in women in factories indicates the collapse of the skilled labor force in the United States. For Berlin, it was a sign of weakness. For Detroit, it was the source of the miracle. Factories began to be adapted not only for technical efficiency, but for accessibility and inclusion. Tools have been redesigned for smaller hands. Workstations have been adjusted for different statures. Pneumatic systems replaced heavy levers. In Long Beach, Douglas Aircraft reduced the defect rate from 3.2% to 0.3%, just by introducing women as quality inspectors. The social engineering of democracy was not rhetoric, it was functional. There were daycare centers next to the assembly lines, night cafeterias, public transport systems to take workers from peripheral neighborhoods to industrial complexes. Elderly workers were trained for technical support roles. People with disabilities were allocated to detailed tasks, such as installing instruments and calibrating panels. This mobilization was voluntary, decentralized, organic. Each factory adapted to the reality of its community, and each community became an extension of the national effort. Instead of enforcing obedience, the American state offered opportunity. The Nazi ideology, stuck to purity and authoritarianism, did not understand that the true differential of democracy was in its power of moral convocation. The United States did not impose the war effort, it inspired it, and when the people responded, production became inevitable. In 1944, America produced 96,270 military aircraft. That same year, Germany, consuming 40% of its industrial capacity from aerial production alone, delivered about 39,000. In four-engine bombers alone, the United States manufactured 16,048 in 12 months. Germany produced less than half of that during the entire war. If this data surprised you, comment below, absolute power or shocking data. We want to know how far this reality also impresses you. Inclusion, often undervalued in times of crisis, proved to be the silent trump card. Workers who were previously invisible became the backbone of the war effort. Every rivet, every engine, every wing installed by someone who didn't fit the traditional mold, it was a direct attack on the Reich ideological arrogance. The Nazis expected a fragile production. They received a human tsunami. Instead of weakness, democracy has shown flexibility. Instead of chaos, she demonstrated adaptation. It was a force that Germany could not imitate, for it did not depend on military discipline, but on civil values. When planes appeared on the horizon, by the hundreds, Luftwaffe pilots didn't just see steel and fire. They saw the reflection of something their generals would never understand, the moral capacity of a free society to organize itself on a full scale. And the impact was not just technical, it was symbolic. Each bomber that left Willow Run or Seattle carried on its fuselage the silent signature of thousands of anonymous workers. Their names were not in the newspapers, but they were in the skies of Europe, changing the course of history. And as Germany's underground factories sank into chaos, sabotage, and logistical failures, the United States ramped up its production, delivering quantity, quality, and innovation simultaneously. The Reich trusted in purity, America trusted in inclusion, and that choice would shape the fate of the war. But American supremacy did not stop at the assembly line, because the real revolution was yet to come, and it would fly higher, farther, and with more power than anything the world had ever seen. In 1944, the air war ceased to be a contest between pilots and became a duel between factories. The most decisive front was on the ground, on the assembly lines, distribution centers, railroad networks, and ports that shipped steel turned into wings to the skies of Europe and the Pacific. And in this scenario, the United States not only outnumbered Germany, it buried it under an avalanche of numbers that no army could contain. While the Reich produced about 94,000 aircraft during the entire war, the United States, in 1944 alone, delivered 96,270. That number alone would mark victory, but it's just the surface. That same year, American industry has produced 281,000 aircraft in total since 1940. There were more than 800,000 aviation engines against Germany's 241,000. In tanks, the difference was brutal. The United States manufactured 88,000 units against the German 46,000. In trucks, the real blood of mechanized warfare, American production reached 2.4 million, while Germany, mired in delays and sabotage, barely exceeded 350,000. The advantage was not only in mass production, but in the intelligence behind it. The American supply chain was an industrial symphony. Components were tracked with surgical precision through IBM punch card systems. Every bolt, every wiring harness, every piece of aluminum was monitored in real time, feeding a national coordination system that turned 184,000 civilian companies into cogs in a unified war machine. While Germany dispersed production in underground caverns, trying to evade Allied bombs, the Americans distributed production across strategically connected geographic regions. A B-29 bomber was built in 4 different factories, with 100% interchangeable parts, assembled in a final assembly in Kansas. This wasn't just scalability, it was planned redundancy, real-time adaptability. And behind this system were statisticians, engineers, and administrators who saw war as a matter of flow, of data, of materials, of time. General Motors alone manufactured more than 57,000 airplane engines. Packard delivered 55,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, the same ones used in the P-51 Mustangs, which destroyed the illusion of Nazi air superiority. In each element, the pattern was the same. While the Germans created powerful weapons in isolated laboratories, the Americans produced solutions at scale. When the Luftwaffe lost 1,200 fighters a month and could only manufacture 1,000, the United States lost 400 and delivered 2,500. It was an impossible math to beat. American logistics was so efficient that they could supply 2 simultaneous theaters, Europe and the Pacific, without interruption. In December 1944, the U.S. even launched attacks with 1-200 bombers and 900 escort fighters in just one mission. This required not only production, but transportation, fuel, armaments, maintenance, and intelligence, all delivered with surgical punctuality. American troops received hot food, dry boots, spare parts, and ammunition from the other side of the world, on deadlines that Germany could not meet even within its own territory. Supremacy was not only warlike, it was systemic. And this superiority was not born of chance. It was the result of an ideology that saw industry as part of citizenship. Workers were not forced, but volunteers. Ideas circulated from the bottom up. Assembly lines evolved with input from workers, tested in combat, and returned to factories with technical feedback in days, not months. This created a cycle of permanent innovation that Nazi rigidity could never replicate. Germany, as much as it was proud of its Tiger tanks or Messerschmitt fighters, faced an insurmountable dilemma. Quality without quantity is irrelevant in total war, and the generals began to notice. Major Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, reported to Göring in February 1944 that Germany was being crushed by an industrial logic. It didn't matter the pilot's skill anymore. What mattered was the impossibility of facing successive waves of bombers and escorts, replaced faster than they could be shot down. General Friedrich Fromm stated as early as 1945 that the war had been lost not in the field, but in the factory. They outperformed us on every screw, he wrote. And for the attentive viewer, the next piece of data sums up this reality. On June 6, 1944, during D-Day, the Allies used 11,890 aircraft to cover the invasion. The Luftwaffe was able to respond with 319 sorties, a 36-to-1 chasm. This isn't just air superiority, it is the mathematical collapse of an ideology that underestimated the power of democratic production. And when the Luftwaffe fell from the skies, it wasn't shot down by bullets alone. It was buried by spreadsheets, transportation, deadlines, and efficiency. But even in the face of this avalanche, the Reich would still bet everything on a desperate project, a jet fighter, a technological miracle that promised to turn the tide. In the next part, we will reveal how the Messerschmitt Me 262 became the last gasp of a military machine cornered by the enemy's logistics. January 1943. Smoke from North Africa was still hanging over the skies over Tunisia when Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, looked up at the horizon and saw what he described as a flying wall that never ended. They were not squadrons, they were aerial columns, endless rows of B-17 flying fortress bombers, protected by layers of P-38 Lightning fighters, emerging with geometric precision as if sprouting from an invisible assembly line in the sky. This was no longer a war between pilots, it was a war against statistics. The Luftwaffe, trained for one-on-one duels, tried to intercept formations so dense that even when they shot down 5 or 10 planes, another 100 kept flying. Every bomber that crossed German airspace was a product of American industry, logistics and engineering, and a cruel reminder that the skies now belonged to the mathematics of production. In Berlin, the reports began to change tone. They no longer spoke of aerial combats, but of attack waves. At the front, veteran pilots realized that the problem wasn't that the enemy was better, it was that it was impossible to contain. For each formation intercepted, 2 others were unharmed. On 27th of January 1943, in the first major raid on German territory, 91 B-17s hit industrial targets at Wilhelmshaven. Even with losses, the mission proved a point. The United States was now able to strike directly at the industrial heart of the Reich, and they were just getting started. In the following months, hundreds of planes began to cross the English Channel daily. The Luftwaffe, pressured on multiple fronts, had to relocate fighters and veteran pilots to defend its territory. But it was too late. With each attack, the Americans learned. They corrected routes. The number of escorts increased. Navigation systems improved. The sky has become a laboratory of total war. In September 1943, during the attacks on the Schweinfurt bearing factory, 291 bombers were sent. The Luftwaffe managed to shoot down 60. But the following month, Americans came back with 291 again, then 360, then 700. The Germans were fighting against a pattern that did not cease, was not intimidated, and worse, it was growing. Major Günther Rall, another Luftwaffe ace, once remarked that flying against the Americans was like trying to stop a train with arrows. Morale among the German pilots began to crumble. Many reported feelings of worthlessness. The anti-aircraft defense was saturated, fuel rationed, and each new wave of bombers seemed to completely ignore the German effort. Instead of weakening, they returned more numerous, better armed, more protected. On the field, the signs of the rupture were visible. Officers like Steinhoff realized that air warfare had changed its nature. Before, the Luftwaffe could win by tactics, by surprise, by dominating the airspace. Now, they were fighting against the industry, and the industry is not afraid. He does not hesitate. It just continues. In 1943, while Germany produced 25,527 aircraft for the full year, the United States delivered 85, 898. It was like fighting with swords against a dam. The German individual effort was engulfed by the logic of mass production. Each B-17 shot down was quickly replaced by another that was already en route. What's more, each new mission brought improvements, from training in cross-protection boxes to longer escorts with the development of extra tanks for the fighters. The Luftwaffe, overwhelmed and out of breath, began to focus its hopes on experimental weapons such as rockets and jet fighters. But the war was no longer about cutting-edge technology. It was about delivery, about constancy. And in this, the Americans reigned supreme. The sky, which for years was the domain of the Reich, became a field of moral imposition. Each bomber that crossed Germany was a reminder. Democracy, once seen as weak and disorganized, now imposed presence, rhythm, and destruction with an industrial cadence. German pilots, even the most decorated ones, felt powerless. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Dahl wrote in his diary, "We can destroy 30, 40 of them, but where do so many others come from? It's like fighting the sea. And the sea is not defeated with courage. It is defeated with dams, dikes, calculations." The Luftwaffe was finally beginning to understand. But understanding was not enough. It was necessary to react. And Germany would bet everything on a radical project, the first operational jet fighter in history. The Messerschmitt Me-262 promised to turn the tide. But when he entered combat, he would encounter not only airplanes. He would find an invisible army of workers, spreadsheets and supplies that had already sealed the fate of the Reich even before its engines started. February 1944. The operation was named Big Week, but what really happened was an era divider. For 6 consecutive days, between February 20th and 25, the skies of Germany turned into an industrial bombing field. There were more than 3,500 sorties by American bombers, accompanied by about 3,000 escort fighters, launching a coordinated attack against the Reich's main plane, engine and component factories. Stuttgart, Augsburg, Regensburg, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, cities that had supported the backbone of the Luftwaffe, now turned to ashes at the pace of production. But the real target of Big Week was not on the ground, it was on the air. Because in addition to the bombs, what the Allies were looking for was the Luftwaffe in combat. And the trap worked. Desperate to protect its industry, the German Air Force threw what was left of its best fighters and pilots against the offensive. The struggle was intense. The Bf-109s and FW-190s had been climbing in squadrons to intercept the bomber formations, but now they encountered a new obstacle, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang fighters, which accompanied the bombers to their target and back. The sky has become a whirlwind of fire and steel. In just 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost between 260 and 355 fighters, but the most devastating number was not in the carcasses that fell in forests or snowy fields. It was in the booths that were empty. There were about 100 veteran pilots killed, men with years of experience, rigorous training, and hundreds of accumulated combats, men who could not be replaced. Meanwhile, the Americans, even with losses, replaced planes, engines, and crews at an automatic pace. For every B-17 shot down, there was another already rolling off the production line. For every scorer lost, a school in Kansas made 5. The equation was cruel. Adolf Galland, the general in charge of Germany's air defense, wrote a direct memo to Göring after the operation. "We lost more than planes. We lost time. We lost talent. We lost the future." The Reich could still produce aircraft, but it could no longer produce pilots. The German training cycle, originally 18 months, had been reduced to less than 6. Quality dropped, evasion increased, and morale plummeted. Meanwhile, the Americans used simulators, standardized instructors, and scalable programs that guaranteed thousands of new crew members ready every quarter. Air warfare had gone from skill to volume, and Germany no longer followed. On the ground, the damage was also severe. The Messerschmitt plant in Regensburg was hit hard. Production of DB605 engines fell by 46% over the next 3 months. In Augsburg, Daimler-Benz workshops lost 40% of their capacity. In Leipzig, the destruction was so intense that the Germans began the emergency transfer of machinery to caves and salt mines, a desperate attempt to protect what was left of production. But it was too late, because even with intact factories, there was no one left to fly the planes. And without air dominance, there was no transport, there was no reinforcement, there was no effective defense against the next wave. Göring, cornered, began to blame the generals themselves. He said that the fighters were badly positioned, that tactics had failed, that discipline had disappeared. But the truth was undeniable. He had ignored all the warnings. From Boetiker's reports to Galland's warnings. He had bet on the mystique of racial superiority, on the bravery of aces, on the rigidity of the structure. And now, the structure was crumbling. The impact of the Great Week was strategic. From there, the Allies consolidated irreversible air superiority over Western Europe. This meant that preparations for the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, could be made with full air cover. It meant that German trains, factories, and warehouses could be hit accurately without significant opposition. What's more, it meant that every new weapon developed by the Reich, from the V-2 to the Me-262, would face the same obstacle: a sky controlled by thousands of bombers, protected by tens of thousands of fighters. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of world air power, was now torn between protecting factories and surviving the statistics, and in the end, I didn't do either of the two things anymore. The irony was cruel. Göring, who had laughed at the American proposal for 50,000 planes, now watched the destruction of his own aviation, not by a miracle weapon, but by a well-executed spreadsheet. The American victory did not come from isolated genius, but from precise repetition, of constant delivery, of the unthinkable scale. And while the Reich mended caves and improvised teenage pilots, the United States was already preparing its next air offensive, with larger, longer, and more lethal planes. And one of them, specifically, would carry a mission that would change the entire world. With the German skies turned into bombing corridors, the Reich summit resorted to what they called the underground solution. The proposal, approved by Göring in March 1944, was as ambitious as it was desperate: to transfer critical production of airplanes, engines, and weapons to more than 700 facilities built under abandoned mountains, caves, salt mines, and railway tunnels. The official rhetoric was simple: protection from Allied bombing, but the reality soon revealed itself to be a technical, logistical, and human disaster. Underground factories suffered from chronic lack of ventilation, uncontrolled humidity, absence of natural light, and electrical instability. Precision machines, once fitted in a controlled industrial environment, now operated in improper conditions, leading to constant failures, poor durability, and total loss of components. Entire engines were produced and discarded due to premature oxidation. But the breaking point was in the workforce. To maintain this system, the Reich began to use prisoners of war, Jews, and forced laborers taken from concentration camps. At Mittelwerk, the factory for the V-2 rockets, Some 20,000 prisoners died of exhaustion, starvation, and mistreatment. German technicians, even under threat of death, reported frequent sabotage, loose screws, inverted valves, engines that exploded in tests. It was the inevitable side effect of a system that replaced engineers with slaves. Production did not increase. It imploded. Supply lines were fragmented. An airplane that could once be assembled in a single plant now relied on 20 separate factories in hard-to-reach locations with no timing or transportation pattern. Parts arrived out of order, broken, or simply disappeared. Meanwhile, across the pond, Willow Run continued to churn out one B-24 bomber per hour with interchangeable parts, centralized logistics, and workers who received technical training, pay, and respect. That factory alone delivered 8,685 aircraft during the war. The entire German underground complex, adding up all the facilities, barely exceeded 4,000 usable units. The comparison became offensive. Germany, which prided itself on its engineering, now sank into logistical labyrinths of its own making. Components of a Me-262, for example, came from 27 different locations. In many cases, the trains that transported them were bombed. When they weren't, the wagons were lost in collapsed rail systems due to lack of coordination and fuel. By September 1944, 42% of the Jumo engines produced for the jets were deemed inoperable or unusable. Pause for the fact. In 1944 alone, the United States manufactured more than 800,000 aviation engines. Germany just over 241,000, with rising rates of loss and failure. If this contrast surprises you, leave in the comments, "Logistics wins," or "Shocking data." We want to know how far the engineering of democracy impacts you. And this engineering was not just technical, it was moral. In the United States, production lines were organized for efficiency and safety. There were unions, meal breaks, quality teams, and above all, purpose. Workers knew what they were building for, and they knew they were on the right side of history. In the Reich, the factory became an extended concentration camp, and like every field, its logic was death, not production. The result was predictable. For each attempt at reorganization, the Reich created more chaos. Instead of agility, bottlenecks emerged. Instead of delivery, broken promises. Statistics reveal the collapse. Between 1943 and 1945, the average productive efficiency of the German aircraft industry fell by 63%. In some cases, pieces took longer to come out of the underground than they once took to be produced entirely outdoors. The irony struck at the heart of the High Command. The idea that hiding industry would save Germany ended up burying its ability to respond. Speer himself, the Minister of Armaments, acknowledged in 1945 that the attempt to transfer production to underground facilities resulted in irreversible loss of coordination and efficiency. And while the Reich was digging tunnels, the United States was enlarging hangars. While the Germans struggled with water infiltration and sabotage, the Americans optimized rail routes and standardized bolts. Democracy was not only freer, she was more productive, safer, more reliable. What Germany tried to do under the earth, America did under the sun, and did better. And there was still one last card left. A revolutionary, fast, and almost unreachable jet fighter, Göring's final hope. But even that weapon, the Me-262, would be born under the rubble of mismanagement, fragmented logistics, and sabotaged production. Because no machine flies without fuel, without parts, without organization. And no victory is born from caves. In the next part, we'll dive into the birth of the Me-262, the fighter that could have turned the war around, but was sabotaged for what Reich himself despised from the start, the ability to deliver. While Germany buried its industry in cold, damp caverns, desperately trying to protect what was left of its productive capacity, the United States looked up, literally. In mid-1943, while the Reich was still debating how to produce jets with engines that didn't work and parts that didn't arrive, the U.S. War Department released the final funds for the project that would redefine air warfare, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a strategic, technological, and industrial statement. The most expensive aircraft of World War II, more expensive, in fact, than the Manhattan Project. It cost $3 billion, equivalent to almost $50 billion today, but what he brought justified every penny. Pressurized cabin, artillery turrets remotely controlled by analog computers, 5,000-mile range, load capacity of up to 9 tons of pumps. The B-29 wasn't just an airplane, it was a flying factory of destruction, and unlike the German promises, it flew, and repeatedly. The secret, a production system that pushed standardization to the limit. Unlike the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s, which varied from batch to batch, the B-29s came out of 4 different factories, Renton, Wichita, Marietta, and Omaha, and had 100% interchangeable parts. A Kansas-made landing gear fit neatly into a Georgia-made fuselage, a Washington-built set of wings, coupled with millimeter precision to the pressurized cabin set up in Nebraska. This was unheard of. While the Germans struggled to assemble an Me-262 from sabotaged parts in underground mines, the Americans coordinated production lines thousands of miles apart, joined by timed logistics systems and tracking technology. What's more, the B-29s were tested in a wind tunnel, adjusted by civil engineers, and assembled with trained labor in working hours divided into 8-hour shifts with food, transportation, and medical care. Every detail was part of a system that didn't just produce airplanes, it produced patterns. For every superfortress delivered, there was an arsenal of data, spreadsheets, and quality controls, ensuring that the next one would be even better. The Luftwaffe, by this time, had already lost the air war, but the B-29 represented something beyond air superiority. It was the harbinger of modern war, technology plus production plus integration. Each B-29 mission was recorded, analyzed and used to feed back improvements. The system was alive, adaptive, evolutionary, and that made the machine bigger than any general. The intelligence behind production was distributed, collective, and civil. While Germany idolized figures like Galland and Rudel, the US gave its trust to engineers like Edward Wells, Charles Lindbergh as a civilian consultant, and workers like Harold, who oversaw the installation of electrical systems in Wichita. The American war machine was made up of ordinary people, but organized with mathematical precision, and that included the supply chain. General Electric manufactured the gyroscopes. IBM supplied calculating machines for ammunition control. Goodyear produced the tires. Sperry created the shot sights. No parts of the B-29 were improvised. No production line was left to chance. It was the pinnacle of industrial engineering applied to war. In August 1944, the first B-29s began operating in the Pacific. Their missions from the Mariana Islands exceeded 3,000 kilometers one way, attacking Tokyo with unprecedented precision. Japan, like Germany, had no answer. There was no fast enough hunting. There was no radar with sufficient range. There was no defense system that could withstand the number, height, and endurance of those bombers. The only choice was to watch. Germany, upon seeing the reports on the B-29, classified it as an unattainable technological advance. The Germans, who at the beginning of the war had mocked American planes as flying tractors, now saw a generation of aircraft appear in the air that even their best laboratories could not design. And even if they did, they would never be able to produce in volume, because the B-29 wasn't just a product of technology. It was the product of a society that knew how to integrate freedom with responsibility, engineering with capital, worker with mathematics. And as the Reich buried its last hope of a miraculous jet in collapsing tunnels, the United States tested technologies that would define the post-war world. Onboard radars, cabin pressurization, guided missiles, and automated bombing systems. The war there was no longer just about 1945. It was about 1950, about what would come next, about the future domain. And in the basement of a base in New Mexico, a parallel project to the B-29 was developing. An artifact that would never depend on hundreds of planes, but that would use only a single flight to end the war, with an impact never seen before. Because the B-29 wasn't just a precision weapon. He was the messenger of a new world. And the load he would soon carry would show that the true industrial victory is not in quantity, but in the ability to create the unanswerable. June 6, 1944. The skies over Normandy dawn laden, not with clouds but with wings. In a single day, the Allies flew 11,590 aircraft, fighters, bombers, gliders, transport planes, an air force so dense that the sound of engines becomes air itself. On the other hand, the Luftwaffe manages to gather only 319 operational planes. There is no combat. There is crushing, What happens there is not a simple air supremacy. It is the final collapse of an outdated logistics system held back by pride and denialism. For the Germans on the ground, hell breaks loose long before the troops land. Every bridge, warehouse, reinforcement point or strategic crossing had already been mapped by aerial reconnaissance and destroyed with millimeter precision. The battlefront, traditionally linear, was now three-dimensional. American troops didn't just come from the sea, they fell from the sky. More than 13,000 paratroopers were dropped in a few hours, supported by 2,195 silent gliders, carrying everything from ammunition to jeeps and field radios. The landing, which the Germans imagined to prevent with ground resistance, became an encirclement from all angles. For every German soldier trying to defend the coast, there was an invisible army of technicians, engineers, and workmen behind every plane, every parachute, every bayonet. The rear was now the front line. Each C-47 Dakota that crossed the English Channel represented not only a troop load, but a logistical triumph. Refueling missions flew continuous routes, delivering 4,000 tons of supplies a day. Fuel, ammunition, food, radios, batteries, medications, all packaged, coded, and launched with precision over controlled zones. And while the Germans had to move their reinforcements by slow trains and bombed-out roads, the Allies simply flew overhead. The airlift was constant, automatic, relentless. The Luftwaffe, already wounded, could do nothing. Their bases had been destroyed during Big Week. Its experienced pilots were either dead or scattered among dozens of poorly supplied units. Those still flying were young men inexperienced in inferior fighters, with limited fuel and obsolete radios. The German commanders themselves admitted it was no longer a question of fighting for victory, but of delaying defeat. Colonel Günther Rall, a Luftwaffe ace with more than 200 victories, would confess years later, "On D-Day we looked up at the sky and realized that the future had arrived," and he spoke English. The destruction was not only physical but symbolic. Every successful landing on the beach, every cargo dropped by plane, every mission completed without aerial opposition was a reminder of the initial mistake. 4 years earlier, when Roosevelt spoke of 50,000 planes, Göring laughed. In Normandy, he didn't laugh anymore. What the German Marshal had called the American fantasy was now pouring tons of steel and soldiers onto the Western Front with a precision that the Wehrmacht itself could never match. The landing was not just a military operation, it was the physical manifestation of the concept of total war, where every factory, every screw, and every riveting machine had a tactical role. The United States had created something that no German doctrine had envisioned, an airy, mobile, redundant, and ubiquitous supply chain, and it stretched from Utah Beach to Chicago, flawlessly. In less than 72 hours, more than 156,000 troops, 10,000 vehicles, and 600,000 tons of equipment had been transported by sea, by air, by pure mobilization engineering. No army in history had moved with such speed and precision. No economy had ever sustained an operation of this scale. And it all started with a ridiculed goal, a proposal considered absurd, a promise of 50,000 planes. By the end of 1944, the United States would have delivered nearly double that. D-Day was the receipt of the bill, and Germany had no way to pay. But there was still one last calculation to be made, a number so absolute, so decisive, that it did not fit in spreadsheets. A cargo that would fly alone in a single bomber, without escort, without squadron, but with the weight of a civilization. And it was already being assembled. April 1945, Germany was in ruins. Berlin burned under the rubble of 1,000 bombings, and the Reich that imagined itself eternal now struggled for another day of survival. In the midst of the implosion of the Nazi Empire, Hermann Göring, once the most powerful man in the Luftwaffe, was captured by American troops on the outskirts of Salzburg. He offered no resistance. As he was led to the Ashcan prison camp, set up in a former luxury hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, Göring still bore the countenance of an officer of the old regime. Proud, articulate, he trusted that he could convince his captors that he was a statesman, not a criminal. But it was inside that hotel, converted into a cell, that reality began to erode the varnish. The interrogations began with tactical questions and ended with data. The Americans, meticulous, wanted the prisoners to see what they had lost and why. They placed in front of Göring complete reports of American industrial production, graphics, tables, photographs of factories, assembly lines, Serial bombers, Willow Run specifically, became the fixed point of his obsession. The numbers diffused him more effectively than any bomb. A single American facility, just one, had produced 8,685 B-24 bombers. More than the entire Luftwaffe had managed to keep in operation during the final years of the war. Göring asked for details. I wanted to know how many workers, how many engines per day, how many hours did it take to manufacture a fuselage. What had once been contempt for the consumer industry now became silent fascination. American military psychologists recorded his obsessive behavior in confidential reports. I wrote them down on improvised papers, did memory calculations, tried to understand where they had gone wrong. How did they manage to do this without slaves? He asked, not to other generals, but to himself. The irony of this story is that the answer was before him from the beginning. It was no secret. Industrial democracy had bet on organization, technical education, and moral motivation. While the Reich centralized decisions in a handful of fanatics, the United States decentralized intelligence and multiplied efficiency. Göring read about the women who operated drills in 12-hour shifts, about the unions that negotiated increases to maintain productivity, about IBM, which used punch cards to track parts on thousands of production lines, and about the civil engineers who adapted cars to become ambulances, trucks to become track refuelers, tractors to tow fighters. Every item in the arsenal of democracy was the result of continuous adaptation. There was no ideological purity. There was impure, brutal, practical efficiency. What Göring called chaotic improvisation now revealed itself as systemic resilience. Willow Run, for him, became an inverted symbol. Where he once saw a country of amateurs, he now recognized the birth of an unbeatable power. One night, when Göring saw the aerial photograph of the factory, the largest structure under a single roof on the planet, he didn't comment. He was silent. The same silence that took over his subordinates when they realized that the German war plan had not been defeated on the field, but in the warehouses. If you're enjoying unveiling the backstage of this historic turnaround, support the channel, like and subscribe to continue following these in-depth analyses. For many, the war ended when troops invaded Berlin. For Göring, she ended up on a sheet of paper, where she saw that a country of supposedly weak consumers had produced the impossible. But there was still one last wound to be opened, one last report, because the final line of comparison had not yet been shown. An absolute fact, a final production, a statistic that left no doubt, and she would arrive, cold and relentless, in the next room. Nuremberg, November 1945. In the courtroom where the moral ruins of the Third Reich would be exposed to the world, Hermann Göring sits before a trial that goes beyond war crimes. It is a judgment of ideas and numbers. The chief prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson, doesn't just accuse, he dismantles the myth of German superiority with facts, graphs, and statistics. In a room where invasions were once decided, production reports are now read. And it is there under the cold spotlight and in front of Allied judges that the most implacable sentence is handed down, not by words, but by tables. One of them, designed on a large scale, displays 295-959 planes produced by the United States between 1940 and 1945. The Luftwaffe in the same period manufactured 94,677, an abyss of more than 200,000 units. But the numbers are only the surface, because what really condemns Göring is not quantity, it's rhythm. The documents reveal that while Boeing adapted the B-17 for new roles in just 40 days after field tests, it took Germany up to 6 months to implement changes to the Me-109 or FW-190. The bureaucracy and doctrinal rigidity of the Reich prevented adaptation. The Americans, on the other hand, incorporated feedback from drivers directly in the factories. A new model of armor, for example, was approved and integrated into the assembly line in a matter of weeks. The war was being won at the speed of decision, and the court knew that. Another document read aloud showed that Ford's factories used 90% standardized and interchangeable parts, while German industry still struggled with batch variations, absence of central control, and internal sabotage. A captured report from the German Aviation Ministry admitted, "The enemy surpasses us not only in production, but in coordination and operational response." Göring listened in silence. On the outside, he kept his pose. Inside, he knew there was no argument. The power of the Reich had been defeated by something it had despised: decentralized freedom of decision. Democracy had proven to be more efficient than authoritarianism. The data also showed how American automation had changed the war. The factories used numerical control machines, IBM punch card systems, assembly lines that operated 24 hours a day, fed by trains, ships and trucks in logistics networks with rail precision. Germany, in the last years of the war, operated with fractional supplies, interrupted routes and increasing dependence on forced labor, a factor that, in addition to being immoral, was ineffective. Internal sabotage and the desperation of forced labor created more failures than planes. A letter from a German engineer read in court said, "Our planes take off with loose screws and come back with hanging wings. The war was lost in the workshops." The verdict there was not only legal, it was historic. Because the numbers revealed more than the bankruptcy of a regime, they revealed the fallacy of its belief. The belief that terror would organize better than voting, that ideological purity would produce more than diversity, that brute force would win over collective intelligence. The court recognized the war crimes, but he also recognized the crime of despising science, reason, and morality in the name of absolute power. And while the prosecutors ended their arguments with yet another graph, the exponential curve of American production between 1942 and 1944, Göring remained silent. Because there, in front of that projection, there was no more speech. Only the final data remained, but there was still one last document to be revealed, a play that would sum up the entire war in a single number, a number that would not only close the account, but it would seal fate. When the engines finally fell silent and the bombers stopped crossing the skies of Europe, something curious happened. The tools were not discarded. The assembly lines have not been dismantled. The hands that shaped thousands of planes, armored vehicles and artillery pieces simply did not return to their previous routine. They carried a new memory and a new capability. The legacy of the American war effort lay not just in the weapons produced, but in the people transformed. Factories like Willow Run, which had operated with military precision to deliver bombers every hour, were adapted to manufacture automobiles on an unprecedented scale. Processes learned under pressure, extreme standardization, real-time inventory management, rapid product modification, became the heart of the new civilian industry. The post-war period saw an explosion in consumption, yes, but also in efficiency. That which had been designed to destroy was now beginning to build. And with it came the workers. The women who had occupied the men's posts were invited to remain, not as substitutes, but as part of the permanent, productive force. Many became supervisors, instructors, technical specialists. The term Rosie the Riveter was no longer a symbol of emergence but of a new working class. African Americans who during the conflict faced racism inside and outside the factories began to find space. Their skills, tried and tested during the war years, opened breaches in historic walls. Some became section chiefs, others created unions, and many, veterans or not, began to occupy functions that were previously denied by systematic prejudice. Democracy had won the war. Now he was beginning to win within himself. What is surprising is that all this happened without the machine stopping. The United States in the following years not only rebuilt Europe with the Marshall Plan, but also created the greatest economic growth in history. And this would not have been possible without the industrial collection accumulated between 1941 and 1945. The same machinery that pressed B-17 wings now formed truck chassis, precision instruments once used to line up machine guns, calibrated car engines. The conveyor belts that carried fighter jets now moved refrigerators. Knowledge has become civilian. The war engineer became the production manager. The lathe operator started to assemble household appliances. What was born as a war effort became the basis of daily life. And more than physical infrastructure, what was established was a culture. A deep belief, forged in the heat of the factory and under the threat of totalitarianism, that a free nation, when summoned by a higher purpose, can be the most productive force on the planet. This is perhaps the most immeasurable fact of the entire war, because it does not appear in bombing reports, nor in court minutes. It is in the intangible, in the silent pride of a technician as he watches his plane fly, in the collective consciousness that freedom is not just an ideal, it is a competitive advantage. And so, at the end of the war, the world not only saw the United States as the winner, he saw them as a model. Germany, by cruel irony, would also benefit from this legacy. The factories that remained in Allied territory were reused for reconstruction, and with them came the methods, the standards, the principles of total quality. Many German engineers, freed from the Nazi yoke, learned from American productivity reports. Some have migrated, others adapted the teachings, and in less than a generation, West Germany would become an industrial powerhouse, using, in part, what it had once despised. But the memory of that mistake remained. A mistake that began with laughter in Berlin and ended with silence in Nuremberg. A mistake that thought that morality was weakness, that democracy was slowness, that inclusion was disorder, and that civilian industry would never surpass the Reich's war machine. This memory today serves as a lesson, because in a world where technology changes, threats evolve, and hate speech resurfaces, the real force remains invisible, the ability of a free people to organize with purpose. And the story is not over, because there was still one last statistic left, a number that did not fit in graphs or tables, a number so absolute and symbolic that it would forever contain the echo of that laughter. Hermann Göring's mistake was not logistical. It wasn't technical. It was ideological. He believed that democracy was a luxury, that freedom weakened, that diversity was disorder. In his view, strength came from imposed discipline, blind obedience, racial and cultural uniformity. He saw America as an industrial circus, noisy, chaotic, fragmented, incapable of competing with Prussian efficiency. And yet, it was precisely this diversity that defeated him, because what Göring called confusion was, in fact, adaptation. What he classified as weakness was distributed strength, and what he considered impossible, it flew, bombed, and rebuilt. The lesson is not limited to World War II. It projects itself into every era where freedom is called into question. How many leaders today repeat Göring's mistake? How many confuse control with competence? How many look at democracies and see only slowness, debate, contradiction, without realizing that these same elements are the ones that guarantee innovation, resilience, and victory in the long run? To underestimate a free nation is to ignore its greatest power, that of mobilizing, without coercion, millions of brains and arms for a common effort. When there is purpose and not fear, society moves mountains. This is the equation that authoritarian regimes cannot solve, because machines can be copied, methods can be spied on, but the spirit of a free people is not fabricated, it is not imposed, it is not pretended, it is born of mutual trust, the right to disagree, from the idea that greatness does not belong to one race, one party, or one man, but to all who build together. And that's why Göring's laugh echoes as a warning, not to remember the arrogance of the past, but to prevent it from repeating itself. The 21st century will see new disputes, new factories, new threats, and perhaps new laughs of contempt. But when that happens, history will have a ready answer, in a single number, a number that represents more than planes. It represents the strength of a promise kept, and that will now be revealed. Berlin, 1940. A cabinet lit by maps, cigar smoke, and arrogant certainties. Hermann Göring laughs. I laughed at the idea that a nation of mechanics, immigrants, and housewives could make 50,000 airplanes a year. He laughs at the democratic chaos, the slowness of parliaments, the diversity of the workers. But he didn't understand that that laugh wouldn't echo forever. It would be swallowed by 296,429 aircraft, each a direct result of the collective effort of a free society. Germany, with its doctrine of steel and blood, fell not only on the battlefield, but in the field of production. It was defeated by spreadsheets, by schedules, by 12-hour shifts, by rail logistics, by screws delivered on time. The Nazi ideology, based on purity and strength, collapsed before the mathematics of democracy. The war was won on the assembly line before it was even won in the trenches. The lesson is universal. Volume trumps tactics. Logistics decides strategy. No ideology, no matter how disciplined, survives an enemy that knows how to build more, faster, with more people, for longer. Victory does not belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who deliver the most tons. The final sentence, loaded with historical irony, did not come from an American general, but from the very symbol of Nazi arrogance. Captured and beaten down by the weight of numbers, Göring admitted, "We declared war on an industrial giant in our sleep. When he woke up, we were doomed." This sentence closes not just a chapter of the war, it ends an era of illusions about racial, technical, or moral superiority. The American assembly line was, quietly, the most ruthless army of the war. If this story has impacted you, value research and historical truth. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating fact that history tried to forget. And in the comments say, what was the most shocking data for you on this journey? Because war is made of battles but won by details. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.